please.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Lord Agnew. I've got a few follow-ups, and then I'm going to dig deeper into economic crime and legislation, as well as investment in resources to tackle fraud. You mentioned the point about banks and state guarantees and the need to see them doing due diligence. Do you think that there's a case then for the government to hold off honouring the guarantees until there's evidence that banks did all the right things in terms of due diligence before they can take on, they qualify for the state guarantee? And is that something that should be done straight away?
The single most important question to be answered now, because of the urgency. As I said, these are going to start hitting the Treasury in industrial quantities in the next few weeks. And again, I've been asking for the data. When I was the minister, I never got the data. For the briefing for the question, I was told that they had already settled just under £1 billion of state guarantee payouts, and of that, no, I think it was from memory, it was 960 and 220 million, and these are from my memory, I may have got them wrong, were directly attributable to fraud. So those are the numbers I was given to do the question. When I put those out there, the next day the Treasury said, we do not recognise those numbers. Well, great. What are the numbers? This is why we keep going round and round in circles. Why will they not share the data?
Yeah, so just going back to Tom Scholars' rather lengthy response to us, which you've critiqued already, one of the things we could write back to him on is whether the government could, whether they what they're going to do around this and some action ahead of these loan guarantees being honoured. Perhaps, and if there are any other suggestions you have, by all means, do feed them in.
Here we are, all ready for you.
Okay.
So these are the questions I think should be asked.
Thank you.
How much money has been paid out by the Treasury so far to meet the 100% state guarantee on failed BBL loans, broken down by category of loss, including fraud loss? Next, what protocols have been agreed with the BBL lending banks as to a base level of activity required to chase down fraudulent advances of BBLs before you will pay out? Next one, when do you expect to see a proper performance dashboard for each of the main, that's Tier 1 banks, management performance fees?
You're very helpful.
Banging
the
microphone. Just want to move the paper away from the mic, or we won't hear your questions properly.
Sorry.
Yeah. Please keep going. This
we'll
is
go back to
that.
Which one did I muck up?
Third one.
The third one. What protocols have been agreed with the BBL lending banks as to a base level of activity required to chase down fraudulent advances of BBLs before you will pay out? And then when do you expect to see a proper performance dashboard for each of the main Tier 1 banks' management performance of these loans? And then the Chancellor in the Commons, a day or two after I left, made a statement that he said all fraud will be pursued. So my question is, who will do this? Will this be another burden on the taxpayer, or will the banks deliver this as part of the fees they have been paid by Treasury to manage this programme? For me, they are absolutely the crucial questions.
Well, thank you. I think that gives us plenty of food for thought when we reply back and ask ministers and the PermSec those questions, among others. You mentioned the broader point about fraud. So according to the Public Accounts Committee, the latest report found that fraud and error are likely to have cost the UK government as much as 16 billion across the COVID-19 emergency loans. How much do you think that government, given all your expertise and what you've seen, government can recoup? And alongside the points you've already made, what else needs to be done to recoup the money that's been lost to COVID-19 emergency loan schemes? You mentioned 20%. Is that what we should be looking at in terms of effort to get get some of that money recovered, or could we achieve a greater figure?
Yes, again, it's so frustrating not seeing any of the data, but that would be a starting point, I think. I mean, I gave you two examples of data that should be available, which is how much is paid out to individuals from once the loan arrived and how much went abroad. Yep. Those would be markers of fraud. And then the next marker, as I mentioned earlier, is how many didn't start repayments after their 12-month free anniversary expired from July of last year. So,
is there much knowledge? You mentioned this point about people taking bags of cash, British taxpayers' money, out of the country in bags of cash. Did you get a sense of how much of that was going on? You mentioned that you were writing letters to thank officials who managed to stop some of that happening.
Well, I didn't stop it. I just wrote to thank the teams for having the oomph for doing it. You know, I think a letter from a minister congratulating someone is quite a powerful thing. It's a very small gesture, but it tends to be appreciated, and I've always did that a lot in my ministerial career. So I haven't a clue. But these were, I would have fortnightly meetings with the fraud team, and they'd come in with the latest war stories. And one of them that day was, if you hear the border force team in Portsmouth has picked up 2 suitcases of cash, which they challenged the characters leaving the country, and the characters said, this is our bounce back loan money, we're off to buy a house in Turkey. To which the team, very much to their credit, because they didn't know anything about the rules, said, well, that doesn't sound right, we'll keep that, thank you very much, and they just confiscated it. So, I don't think much of that happened, probably. I don't want to overstate it, but it definitely happened.
Thank you. So moving on to the resignation and an article in the Financial Times where you said that an economic crime bill to fill the regulatory gaps should be presented to Parliament. This was foolishly rejected last week as a candidate bill for the next parliamentary session. We now, of course, it's taken a war to get to a point. Your resignation didn't achieve the desired effect, unfortunately, but it's literally now we're looking at this economic crime bill in the light of the international crisis. Are any of the issues that you've raised? What areas are not covered that you think need to be covered? There's been references to a subsequent bill that is going to come. Do you have you helpfully had a list of questions earlier on to the question, but are there things that need to be in this bill and what needs to be in the next bill? And are you confident there will be a next bill, or is it about kicking it into the long grass and people forget about it?
Well, they're very, very good questions, and I've just written my speech for the debate this evening.
Okay, so watch this space.
And you've preempted. Well, you've preempted. I've raised those points, and basically, at the end, I say that this really shouldn't. And this was raised by somebody else that. This shouldn't really be called an economic crime bill, the one that's going through at the moment, because it's about tightening up some land registry disclosures. But it's a start. I'm not, as I said earlier, the unexplained wealth order stuff is an important step forward. So I don't want to be churlish in acknowledging that we'll be better off when this bill goes through than we were a month ago. So let's be positive. But what I am very worried about, and exactly as you've said, is that becomes a narrative. So, we've done our economic crime bill this year, we don't have to do any more on this. And that would be an absolute tragedy, because this only deals with probably 25% of what needs to be done. The Companies House situation is simply terrifying in the gaping holes that exist there in terms of their inability to carry out any proper anti-money laundering checks on people applying for a company. And and the 80. Sorry, did you say 20% of what needs to be covered will be covered by this bill? But there's the rest of it. So that we need a time frame for the next economic crime bill. Yeah. But we're not going to be able to scratch the surface. I don't know if you wanted to. Well, what I've said. I'll read to you what I've written for this evening. I basically.
Are there any key highlights that you want to share with us? Then
yes, I basically said, whilst I accept the government's committed to bringing forward a second economic crime bill later this year, focusing on Company House reforms, it is worth reminding the House that there are gaping holes in our arsenal. For example, Companies House is not required to comply with the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive. This means a company can be registered direct with them without any checks. Around 300,000 companies a year are registered direct with them. So that is just an unforced error, and I don't understand why we can't get that into this bill, but I've been told that we can't, and because I've never been a backbencher before, I'm not familiar with how you kind of lobby to get amendments in. I'm going to try and get a few in tomorrow, but for me that is just such an obvious thing, because company formation agents are required to comply with the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive. But for some weird reason, Companies House is not. And I don't understand that. I mean, maybe you can explain it to me.
I think there were amendments in the Commons to that effect, but obviously a very quick emergency piece of legislation, and those amendments weren't voted on effectively because there were 45 amendments, and we inevitably had to concentrate. But I think that there'd be a lot of sympathy for your comments, Rushanara.
I just have one last question, which is, you mentioned that it would have only taken an extra 2 days to have the relevant checks done. So this argument about needing to respond quickly to a crisis that ministers and others have hidden behind has been shot to pieces in terms of your insights and what could have been done. And as a consequence, the taxpayer's been shortchanged by billions and billions of pounds. Do you think that some of the things you were doing were an inconvenient truth to government ministers who are desperate to respond to the crisis, but also, you know, there have been reports around particular issues around contracts and favouritism and separate pathways that actually, in a way, it was rather it was sort of a distraction for those who wanted to just, you know, get on with it. You know, if you were being really kind to some ministers, some of the ministries, that they wanted to get on with it. They didn't really care too much about how it was done and whether there was waste or fraud or even favouritism and even conflicts of interest in relation to some of the PPE contract scandals. And that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way our government operated during this period, and broader lessons need to be learned about not only how fraud is tackled, but also how ministers conduct themselves, and Whitehall holds truth, you know, holds them, you know, makes sure that officials make sure that ministers behave appropriately in the way they make those decisions that can then leave the taxpayer shortchanged. Is there a bigger issue here alongside the points around, you know, fraud and the checks and balances, the need for expertise and so on?
Well, there is a much bigger issue here. It's down to the whole administration of government. And now, I've tried to avoid overly politicising this. Obviously, I accept you're a Labour MP and a few hits at...
I'm not trying to make a hit. I'm making a broader point
I respect that. I think
and that's why I framed the question in this way, because these are important lessons for any party
yes,
in government and how they operate.
I think I want to take it back a few notches, and hopefully you'll see where I'm coming from. So I was also the Minister for Civil Service HR. You know, that's 450,000 people. And when I first came out of that initial 3 month, the initial lockdown in about August, and I was thinking, why on earth can't anything get done around here? You know, why is it all so difficult? So I thought, well, how do we train our civil servants? You know, how does all that work? So I wrote a very innocent request to the HR department, and I said, how much do we spend every year on training civil servants? How do we know if the training is any good? And how do we monitor the thing? Well, that was a pretty honest, innocent question, I thought. You know how long it took them to answer that question? And I chased it every month. I chased it for 16 months. Finally got the answer in January, and the answer was this. Minister, we're not sure how much we spend on training of civil servants. It's somewhere between 150 and 600 million pounds a year. We don't know how good the training is, and we don't know how effective people are once they've been trained. So that is your problem. That is the problem. Now, you could say ministers should be much more attentive about this, but as you know, the problem with the system is, as a minister, I couldn't fire anybody. You know, you never can.
So we've established there's a need at the official level for improvement and more expertise, more training. Do you think there was the political level? And this would apply for any government, future government, as well as current government. At the political level, there was also ministers turned a blind eye when there were obvious areas where they could have been much more disciplined. I mean, this 2 day, this point about it could have taken 2 days to do these extra checks or insist on these checks would have saved the taxpayer a lot of money. Do you think that actually it just became less of a priority? And what discussions did you have with your political colleagues, your senior ministers, the Treasury ministers and others, to raise the flag, or raise alarm bells at the political level?
I think my answer to that question is that the system was overwhelmed at the moment of COVID. It was just blown out of the water. And so I don't think that ministers were inattentive. But this is where I come back to my point, is what level of detail does a minister have to go to be seen to be doing his or her job? And at what point do the civil service should be relied upon to get the detail right? That's really my point. Now, I'm a detail person, so for me, detail is quite easy. But there's three types of politicians out there. Those who are good at talking, there are those who are good at thinking, there are those who are good at doing, and a very small number can do all three of those things. I mean, that's fair, isn't it? That's fair. So, and you look at the backgrounds that you will come from to become MPs and then in due course ministers. You're not equipped to ask the sort of questions that need to be asked in these situations. So, for fraud, fraud is in my DNA, because when I was 18 years old, I was a licensed private inquiry agent in the New South Wales court system, going around as a sort of gumshoe aged 18. I learnt about the criminal mind when I was 18 years old. I'm 61. I'm interested by it. It challenges me. Why do these very clever people want to go onto the dark side rather than make their money legitimate? It's just one of my quirky interests, But for most people, it's just very dull and boring and unpleasant. And so it's a really difficult question. Yes, you can say ministers should have asked more difficult questions. They should have drilled deeper.
If only there were more ministers like you in government.
Well, you say, I don't know. I think that's not fair, because I'm not a good communicator. I'm not someone who'll go and kiss babies.
I think you are doing. I think you are doing okay at the moment, Lord Agnew. And I just wanted to put on record that Mel Stride, our chairman, is probably watching, wrapped at the television screen, and not here because he's still suffering from COVID. I just wanted to put that on the record in case people wondered